Wake that ass up.
Early in the morning.
The Breakfast Club.
Morning, everybody. It's DJ Envy, Angela Yee, Charlamagne the Guy. We are the Breakfast Club. We have a special guest on the line this morning.
Yes, indeed.
Ilyasah Shabazz. Welcome.
Thank you. It's so great to be here. I know I saw Charlamagne not that long ago.
Mm-hmm.
And Angela and DJ Envy, I look at you guys and listen to you guys pretty often.
Well, thank you.
Well, good morning. How are you today?
Pretty good. How about you?
Blessed, black, and highly favored. Every time I see you, you glowing. Like just glowing. Just aura on 1,000.
Okay. Well, maybe that's living right.
Yeah.
There you go.
Absolutely.
Mm-hmm.
Well, we obviously are here today to talk about your young adult novel, The Awakening of Malcolm X. And there's been a lot of new developments also, just, as of late. I saw this letter that was released from Ray Wood, the officer, FBI agent that went undercover that actually framed and was responsible for Malcolm X working in conjunction to get him assassinated. So what were your thoughts when you saw that?
Well, Angela, I can say that I'm just as curious as you are uncovering the truth. We always wanted to know what the truth was surrounding my father's assassination. We know that he posed, a great danger. And so it's, we're just as curious as you are to uncovering the truth.
Absolutely. I love...
It must still be difficult to hear all these things coming up too, because that's your dad. For a lot of us, he's a hero and he's such a great figure to us, but for you, that's your father. So I know it's not easy to have to hear these things coming back up over and over again.
Well, I think whatever you do in the dark always comes to light. And, immediately I think of my mother, and I think, of this woman who had her home firebombed on the evening of Valentine's Day as she lay asleep with her husband, that a bomb would be thrown into the nursery where her babies, where my sisters and I slept. And then that a week later, she would witness the horrific assassination of her husband. And in spite of all of those challenges, she raised her 6 daughters with just so much love in a very small bubble, and made sure that we understood who our father was, who her husband was, so that we didn't grow up feeling that our father left us, but we knew that he loved us and would be proud of any kinds of accomplishments we were making. And if we didn't do something right, she would say, your father would be disappointed. So, I always take my hat off to this woman. She continually gave, and she instilled the values that just as one must drink water, one must give back. And, so for my mother, a young woman in her 20s, to experience that, for me, that is probably the most difficult part. And so, yes, we are very curious, and definitely want to uncover the truth.
And I was reading that you were saying that your mom didn't really speak much about the things that he did, and you had to get a lot of that knowledge from his autobiography. Is that true?
My mother focused on instilling love and making sure our identity was intact, so that when we would leave her, under her wing, that we would be able to navigate through society's injustices. And so we didn't learn about the icon Malcolm X because then you had to introduce hate. And if my mother was, a witness to the brutality, the surveillance, all of the challenges that her husband and she endured, certainly she wanted to protect her babies and of course, even to witness his assassination. There's a picture of my mother. She was a registered nurse at the time, with my father with all these bullet holes in his chest, and she's undoing his tie, to help. I could only imagine how traumatic that had to have been. So my mother focused on love, kindness, joy, all the things that my father wanted for any oppressed people to have, the opportunity to know that they're worthy of love, self-love, and, respect for our humanity.
Queen Ilyasah, on the anniversary of his death, which was yesterday. How do you feel? How do you mourn?
Well, it's not really easy, but I continue in the tradition of what my mother always did, and my mother always had, we always had a memorial celebration. It was a celebration of life for our father, and it was at Abyssinian Baptist Church for a very long time. And then, now we have it at the Shabazz Center. So, we continue in that tradition. And fortunately, because of this pandemic and virtual programming, we had people from all around the world. And so that's, a great opportunity to fellowship in that way.
I love the idea of a young adult novel, The Awakening of Malcolm X, which is spotlighting Malcolm's formative adolescent years in prison, because I think it's very important to really dive into that whole process of who Malcolm was, because I often say this generation wouldn't let Malcolm Little become Malcolm X because of this whole cancel culture thing. So what can this generation learn from your father's adolescent years in prison?
Well, first of all, I wanted to make sure that my father's story was accurate, that his father was the chapter president of the Marcus Garvey movement, the Universal Negro Improvement Association in the 1920s, which commanded millions of followers worldwide, that his mother was the recording secretary for this organization, and that his family was targeted, and that his father was lynched by the Black Legion, which was a splintered group from the KKK, and that his mother was put into an institution. His father purchased land that was reserved for whites only during the height of Jim Crow. And once they lynched his father and put his mother away and separated Malcolm and his siblings, they took the land. And so Malcolm, as a youth, was running from his identity, running from the pains that he experienced during Jim Crow. And when he finally was arrested, his family had the opportunity to encourage him to read again. And one of the things we discover is that Malcolm was always bright, smart. All of these values that we see in Malcolm was mostly because of the foundation that his parents and family provided. And so it speaks to the importance of us smart, forward-thinking adults to be the village for our children when we know they're in pain, when we know that their identity is, questionable. And so while in jail, my father continued to read. He studied the dictionary, not so he can learn how to write. He studied the dictionary because he was a star debater on the debating team of the prison that debated against Ivy League schools. And he studied so he could understand the etymology, the root of words, because he always wanted to be prepared. And, there are so many interesting things about the awakening of Malcolm X. I had the opportunity to work with Tiffany D. Jackson, who is a phenomenal young adult novelist. And, we wanted to focus on the humanity of inmates. We know there are approximately 3 million people in our nation's prisons today, but do we know that the United States spent 81 billion taxpayer dollars on correction facilities, not education, not after school programs, but on correction facilities. And that since 1970, the incarcerated population has increased by 700%. And this is what's happening to our children. And so each of us has to ask ourselves, are we going to be a part of the problem by doing nothing and pretending that we don't understand these things? Or are we going to be a part of the solution by rolling up our sleeves and demanding change?
Yeah, one thing when you read this book, you really do have the opportunity to see what the horrific conditions were for these inmates. And a lot of people are talking about prison reform right now. So I think a book like this is really important for people to see. A lot of people were in jail for crimes they didn't even commit, or maybe it was something small. As a young adult, he went to jail for something that really wasn't that big of a deal and ended up being in there for such a long time in really awful conditions, to the point where it could drive somebody crazy.
That's right. Because, what do they say? That it's not conducive for human survival to put someone in solitary confinement. All of these atrocious laws, all of these atrocious policies, all of these atrocious acts, that we can't just continue to allow these things to happen. My father said it would be this generation of young people who would recognize that those in power have misused it and demand change, and that they would be willing to roll up their sleeves and be a part of this change. And that's something that we witnessed this summer, during a pandemic, and while watching this horrific killing of George Floyd and the subsequent killings that we continue to see in social media.
Yeah,
even the idea of getting the vaccine, because we see that they tried to make all the prisoners get this vaccine. It was an experiment, and if they didn't take it, they would get sent away to a worse prison. What's your thoughts on this vaccine now? Because obviously we don't trust vaccines because of what's been done in the past as guinea pigs.
I agree with you, Angela. I'm still up in the air about it. I have not gotten vaccinated. I do wear a mask. I try to be as cautious as I possibly can because, we don't know who we can trust.
You mentioned a couple of things I want to follow up on. You were finishing up edits for this book right around the same time George Floyd was murdered. Did that change the way you thought about the project at all?
It didn't change the way I thought about the project because, my parents made sure that we were compassionate and that we were critical thinkers. And this is something that I even encourage with my students. And I think it's something that my father encouraged for us, to read and understand history and understand, all of these things that involve us, understand the political system. And, this is what I can say. During the pandemic, when we didn't know what it was, we didn't know if we were going to live or die, right? We were questioning our mortality, that there was a gentleman on the West Coast who was working on a film. There was a gentleman in Japan who's working on the biography, and the three of us would have these phone, chats. And we would talk about all of the interesting findings that we had. And I can't begin to tell you the files that I was able to get on my father while in prison, which had somehow disappeared, but many of these documents were in other inmates' files, and this biographer just happened to have them. So it was an opportunity for us to share information and to believe that it was an epiphany, believe this as an epiphany, that it was no coincidence that each of us would be talking at this time and that we were going to survive this pandemic so that we could put this work out. That's what I can say about this. But, already being aware of these kinds of injustices that continue to happen to our people since slavery. We forget, when people ask me questions about my father, I'm like, you don't understand what slavery was, this
That's
whole
right.
system. You don't understand what Jim Crow was, the entire system. And it all continues today. And it won't change until we sit down and do this work that needs to be done to change it.
Even though the book is historical fiction, do you see parallels to today's current events?
Absolutely. And that was really the purpose of this book, because, the same systemic issues are here, the same, nothing has changed, and it's not going to change until we do something. We have to learn to control our own narrative, and we can't sit back and just think that someone's going to do something for us. My father said only a fool would sit back and allow his enemy to teach his children. If we want change, we have to be willing to do the work ourselves. And I think that now there is a multiracial, this movement that's driving our nation towards a more civilized space because of our young people, that a synthetic identity is being born, our society is moving forward, and bigotry and all its ugly hate is losing, and a new era has yet to define itself. And so we have to, surmise that cheaters lose, character wins, moral character wins, and that should be a lesson for our young people.
What would you advise people to say? Because we talk about change, but, Donald Trump's in office, Joe Biden is in office. Do we see him helping us? And we say we have to do for ourselves. So what would you consider us to do for ourselves?
That, we have to get our collective leaders together. There's not just one leader, but coming together, organizing, strategizing. We see all these dynamic young people. I mean, I watch Angela Rye and Brittany Packnett and many of the Congressional Black Caucus members. I think that it's important for us to come together in this collective leadership and organize amongst ourselves to figure out what our strategies are. And that's, a lot of what my father did. In the 1950s, when young people were marching, protesting, demonstrating, my father came along and said, look, we demand our human rights as your brother. We demand our human rights ordained by God. He was willing to do the work. And look, we all organized to do so. And so it's important for us to first make sure that we understand, these all of these different divisive tactics that have continually happened, and ensure that they don't happen again. That if there are 8,600,000,000 people in the world and 80% of us are people of color, we should be able to come together and figure out how we can get this boot off our necks.
That's right. What does by any means necessary mean to you? Because I think a lot of times when people hear that phrase, they automatically think wake up with violence on the mind. Like, you know what I mean? What does that mean to you?
Right. By any means necessary means that, again, if we're talking about collective leadership, then we have to know that we are worthy of self-love, that we are worthy of a quality education, that we are worthy to participate in mainstream society. And so it means that we have to invest in ourselves, just as my father did. My father read everything that you could imagine, and he refused to allow anyone to pigeonhole him. And so I would say the same thing for us, that we have to be diligent with the same kinds of, same kinds of examples.
Absolutely.
I saw that you also had Jackie Robinson incorporated into the book, and I was reading an article on the Undefeated about Jackie Robinson and Malcolm X because they were critical of each other, but they did agree on some things. So can you expand on what their relationship was like?
Well, even with Dr. King, there was this semblance of respect, right? And just because we can critique one another, but I think that my father being critical of a lot of these leaders that we had, or that people would use as our leaders, it was during his younger days. And, I think what's more important is us coming together and addressing these issues that exist.
Mm-hmm.
Absolutely. You use a lot of your father's quotes, right, to begin chapters. And in chapter 2, it starts with the quote, "You can't separate peace from freedom because no one can be at peace unless he has his freedom." What do those words mean to you?
Oh, my goodness. Well, listen, you can't be free. I mean, just what it says, right? That as long as anyone is preventing you from having a sense of peace, we're looking over our shoulders. We're scared by the police. There are just so many traumatic experiences that we've had generation upon generation. And in order for us to have peace, we have to get rid of these things. My father said, if you put a knife in my back 9 inches and pull it out 6 inches, the knife is still in my back.
That's right.
If you pull it all the way out, there's still no progress. And so the only way we're going to have progress is by addressing a lot of these inaccurate things, for instance, in our education curriculum, right? That I have here, if the terrorism of slavery and the subsequent massacres of Black Wall Street in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Rosewood, Florida, for example, are taught in high school US history classes to be as American as the Boston Tea Party, then our education curriculum would be based on historical facts, and more citizens would understand the necessity for reparations today. We have the opportunity to ensure that we are instilling a value system in our young people of truth, honesty, and human compassion. And if in world history classes, the truth that Africa is the cradle of the most advanced civilization ever to exist in mankind, and the impressive kingdoms of Futajello, Benin, Ghana, Mali, Egypt got even half the attention that Greece and Rome do, then we might appreciate the present complexity of Black civilizations in Africa without teaching our children hate and discrimination, but rather to love and respect themselves and then for humanity. And, you know, and I think that that basically sums it all up.
That's right.
Absolutely.
You know, I often wonder why this system, when you think about teaching, it seems like they've never tried to whitewash the legacy of Malcolm X. Like, they tend to water down a lot of our heroes. I don't feel like they do that with Malcolm. Actually, it's almost like they don't want people to even research Malcolm at all. But why do you think that is?
That's absolutely right. And you know, even the false image that we have of Dr. King.
Yep.
And the false image of Malcolm X. And I think that, you know, what do they say? In the 1950s, Carter G. Woodson said, the biggest race is to see who can control the minds of young people. Do you want them to be like Dr. King, or do you want them to be like Malcolm X? Let's create this passive, turn the other cheek image of Dr. King and get all of these young people to follow that, and not this image of Malcolm X, you know, who they say was violent and all of these other things, when look at the violence that has, you know, been afflicted on us since the time they took us out of Africa, since the time they enslaved even the Black indigenous people who were already here. Look at all of this violence, you know, and as James Baldwin said, let's not focus on me, let's focus on you. What is it about you that had to turn me into your slave? What is it about you that had to turn me into a criminal instead of allowing us to have peace and freedom?
Absolutely. 100%. What do you think Malcolm would say to young Black teens in America, right? Brother Malcolm, I'm sorry. What would you think Brother Malcolm would say to young Black teens in America right now?
I think he would really encourage critical thinking, that he would encourage us to continue to organize, strategize, and not stop. You know, that we have to speak up, but we have to be organized and strategic. And that, you know, we really do need this village. The education system is something that I am extremely passionate about. It's something that my mother, you know, instilled in me. I'm so grateful, you know, to have had the opportunity to know my history and to love who I am, so that I can see myself as a reflection of you and you as a reflection of me, and love you, you know, unconditionally. I keep my distance if things aren't healthy, but, you know, to love unconditionally and to be willing to make the change that we all know is imminent.
And what do you think your father would
Right.
how he would view Barack Obama, the first African American president? What do you think his views would be on that?
You know, I can't tell you what how my father would view Barack Obama, but I can say that President Obama did send me a letter saying, you know, how much he appreciated Malcolm, and even in his book, the Letter to My Father, that it was Malcolm's insistence and self-respect that enabled him to develop a healthier identity for himself and live a more purpose-driven life.
Really?
How do you deal with not feeling like tremendous anger toward white people, just knowing everything that your father went through, and even, you know, the FBI and the whole system? How do you deal with that?
Well, it's bigotry. It's this so-called white supremacy, and it's ignorance. And, you know, it is the reason that my mother made sure in our formative years that she encouraged, you know, all of this love. And, you know, I can't begin to tell you how much love, you know, I had growing up, and it gave me a sense of security. I don't feel inferior. I don't feel intimidated. I do understand when I see ignorance. And so it's my responsibility to give back in some way. As she said, just as one must drink water, one must give back. And if there is a way for me to give back and address some of these issues, I do. And it's the reason why I've written 5 books. And it's the reason why I am a professor at John Jay College of Criminal Justice. And the course that I focus on is perspectives on perspectives on justice in the Africana world. And so I think it's extremely important first, to focus on who you are, who we are, and then work on these other. I can't even give you a word for, the stuff that we have endured over the past 400 plus years.
I got a couple more questions before we go, but you mentioned a couple of our strongest voices earlier. You mentioned Brittany Packett and Angela Rye. I wonder why it feels like the sisters are on the front lines and more vocal than the brothers. I would throw Tamika Mallory in there as well. Like, why do you think that is right now?
Well, I think this has been something, this has been historical, the Black woman. We look at, just like you said, the women that you mentioned, or even Stacey Abrams, who delivered, almost 1 million votes to help us win, have this Democratic victory. Just think who would be in office right now. But I think it's important to understand that Black power is not exclusionary. It simply says that we are going to be at this table. And that is something that we can't forget. My father said that a society is measured by the progress of its women. When you teach a young man, you teach a community, but when you teach a woman, you raise a nation. And I think that we have seen such evidence of that.
Absolutely. I do want to talk to you about chapter 4 too, though, because you use one of his quotes with a common goal of 22 million African Americans is respect as human beings. And we can never get civil rights in America until our human rights are first restored. When you read that quote, how do you think he would view that goal in 2021? Because I always say that now, like, we fighting for civil liberties, but they don't even respect us as humans.
Well, that's right. And that is one of the reasons why he was assassinated. He internationalized first the struggle for Black people worldwide, because remember, in the 1950s, we didn't even know that we were, of the African diaspora. We didn't know that Blacks in the Philippines, Blacks in Australia, Blacks in China, Blacks in the Americas, Blacks on the continent. We didn't even know we were all experiencing the same oppression. And so he internationalized that struggle for us. So we understood that we came from Africa, we have a land base, and then introducing a human rights agenda to the civil rights movement so that we could be strategic about this and take this, to the to the United Nations Supreme Court and challenge those for violating our human rights. Yes, I think that is extremely important. And when we look at the Constitution, when we look at all of these documents that were created, we'll see that, we weren't included as human beings, that we were just property. And so we have to correct history. And again, that is addressing our education curriculum. And, yeah.
Absolutely. Well, The Awakening of Malcolm X, a novel, is out right now by Ilyasah Shabazz. Mm-hmm.
Yes, amazing read, though. I really did enjoy reading that. I was like, I think for a lot of kids in school, or even like somebody my age, it was a great read. So thank you so much for your time today. And also, finally, too, the autobiography of Malcolm X, read by Lawrence Fishburne, is up on Audible. That came out last fall.
That's right, it sure did. And it's the first week that it was released, it was #1. Lawrence Fishburne did an amazing job. And, I loved how from each chapter was this really wonderful period music, which just kind of brought you right into Malcolm's thought and that whole time. And I really enjoyed it. And listen, every time I hear myself on the radio or doing some kind of interview, I sound like I'm just being so passionate. And in retrospect, I always say that I want to, tone it down, but it's difficult to tone it down when we look at these, horrific conditions that we are forced to live. And I just hope that all of our young people, remain strong, remain focused, that you don't look at these or don't fall for these divisive tactics, because at the end of the day, they are just that. They're divisive and they prevent us from accomplishing our goals. And it is extremely important with all of those great people that we have, all those shoulders that we stand upon, that we are able, to win.
That's right.
Well, thank you for joining us so much, man. And we appreciate you and everything that you're doing. And pick up her book right now. And thank you.
Thank you so much.
Thank you very much.
Ilyasah Shabazz is The Breakfast Club. Good morning.
Peace.